Hello folks, welcome to another edition of the Dr. Mark Foster Show. Today I will talk about a more personal subject, autism. Back when I was a kid, autism was not a very common diagnosis. In fact, in the DSM-1, which is the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of the American Psychiatric Association, first edition, autism is only mentioned in connection for children with childhood schizophrenia. Consequently, that is how I and many other autistics were diagnosed. Fortunately, because of some circumstances which were actually more related to my OCD, obsessive compulsive disorder, than my autism, pardon me, still have a little bit of a cold, I went to see a psychiatrist, which is something that I swore to myself I would never do, given the way that I was treated by psychiatry as a kid. Put on very, very heavy tranquilizers, given electroshock treatments, electroconvulsive therapy when I was 11 years old. It was a very difficult life. I was teased, beaten up regularly, had a bone broken once, was at one time placed into a special school because they didn't know what to do about other people beating me up, so I guess they felt, well, we'll put him in a special school, which they did. I protested, got out, went back to my regular school, and fortunately, the abuse from other kids stopped. It was amazing to me. I didn't expect that, but it did. As I got older, my symptoms gradually went away, more or less. I became more adaptable. My empathy was still not there, but I was able to function, obviously. Went on and got a Ph.D. Straight out of high school. Took 1 year off in the middle to get to work and travel. Other than that, I've remained in academia since being a freshman in college and now being a full professor of sociology. But because of that OCD incident, I went to see a psychiatrist, as I said. He asked me to tell him my life story, which I did. And he said, "Oh, that sounds like Asperger's. Asperger's autism." Well, the term Asperger's is being phased out, replaced with autism spectrum disorder, a term I prefer. Autism is related to the word auto, which I think describes me and my independence pretty well. Asperger's, on the other hand, is named after a guy named Hans Asperger, whom I never met. Had nothing against him, but I never met the guy. So I much rather think of myself as an autist or an autistic than I would as an Aspie or somebody with Asperger's. Pardon me again. I called up my old child psychiatrist, who's still alive. At least he was a couple of years ago. Assume he still is. I imagine he's somewhere in his late 70s, early 80s now, but still sounds the same. And had a conversation with him, and he said, "Well, if you were walking into my office right now, I would diagnose you with Asperger's and OCD, which is the same as how I was diagnosed by my present psychiatrist." It didn't certainly eliminate all the pain I went through, but at least it resolved certain issues, kind of, I guess, sewed up some things that were torn, that needed to be repaired. And I felt at least somewhat more comfortable with myself, at least knowing that I did not have childhood schizophrenia. Something that I had more or less forgotten anyway, because it was pretty obvious to me that that was wrong for years. But I guess I was never really that curious about what the problem was, which in retrospect seems a bit odd to me as to why I never really pursued it to find out independently what the problem was. But it was a tremendous relief to discover this. After my diagnosis, I went online, pardon me again, and I found that there was a large online autistic subculture. Much of it is an anti-cure autistic subculture, and for whatever reason at the time that kind of appealed to me. Basic idea was that we are all neurodiverse. We all have neurological diversity, in other words. That neurodiversity should be respected, which I still agree with, and that therefore any attempt to cure autism in the minds of some people in the anti-cure movement is basically a kind of eugenics. In other words, wiping out a culture. A very similar view that some people in the deaf rights movement feel about attempts to eliminate deafness, such as through cochlear implants. In fact, the autistic rights movement got their basic idea from the deaf rights movement, so it's a direct relationship. In any event, I was never entirely comfortable with that idea, but I accepted it, and I kind of related it to my background as a critical sociologist at the time, before I returned to critical realism. Pardon me again. And so I developed an entire approach to that, and in fact I would even discuss it with my students that I was autistic, and try to weave it into my classes using myself as an example. That did not work out very well, and some students apparently didn't like me doing it and told me so, and so I stopped doing it, and so now I no longer mention my autism to my students, unless somebody asks me after class, in which case I'm certainly willing to discuss it, but I don't discuss it in my classes. A few years ago, in the midst of studying Sufism, which is a Islamic mysticism, I started to think, well, maybe I should try to practice some type of Sufi meditation. And I kind of put a bunch of things together, looked up some stuff, became extremely attracted to this 17th century Punjabi Sufi named Hadrat Sultan Bahu, and I read a lot of his stuff, became very drawn to him, began to love him, and as a result of my attraction to him, I actually started a kind of informal, non-Muslim Sufi order. Eventually I realized that would be confusing, and I shut that down and replaced it with a personal Baha'i project that is now called Unities of All Things. Through my encounters, through meditation, with Hadrat Sultan Bahu, I just developed this tremendous love for him and for his soul, and which I still have. When I close my eyes, I can feel him with me. My heart opened, and literally, and this is no exaggeration, for the first time in my life, I experienced empathy. I developed a sense of compassion and love. I always had sympathy, but there's a difference between sympathy and empathy, which I found that a lot of autists that I've met don't seem to understand. Many autists are sympathetic and care about people and have a very strong sense of social justice, but empathy is not the same thing as that. Empathy is actually being able to feel what other people feel, to relate one's own experiences to somebody else, to put one's heart into somebody else, not one's mind, but one's heart. Excuse me. And that's what I did. I drew close to Sultan Bahu. Eventually I drew close to other beings in the next world, my spiritual mother, Elizabeth Thomas, other dear souls that I began to refer to as my spiritual family, whom I will read off now as a tribute to them, my mother, my father, all of my grandparents, my step-grandfather, Sam Libson, again, my spiritual mother, Elizabeth Thomas, my dear and beloved friend, Henry Weil, whom I feel extraordinarily close to, Marion Lippett, who inspired my spiritual mother, along with Henry Weil having inspired her, and much of my approach to the Baha'i writings is influenced by Marion Lippett and by Henry Weil, as well as Elizabeth. Of course, Hadrat Sultan Bahu, my late friend Dave Felos, who was killed by a drunk driver, Imogene Hoag, who was Marion Lippett's teacher, my Uncle Dave, Eunice Braun, former auxiliary board member, Mr. Zekrullah Khadem, the auxiliary board, the Baha'i Hands of the Cause of God, whom I was closest to, met on several occasions, spent a long time with, my late friend Anna Hall, my Aunt Hannah, my late friend Rahia Macomb, who actually met Abdul-Baha at least 19 times as a child, was named by him. Her birth name was Musette Montana Jones, but Abdul-Baha named her Ruhia. And Betty Bullock, who was one of my colleagues in the sociology department where I work. She died of cancer, and I feel as though she got me interested in a number of subjects that she was interested in from the other side, and I feel a very strong sense of connectedness to her too. So as a result of that, I to be honest with myself, I could no longer refer to myself as somebody who was involved with the anti-cure movement. Now, that is not to say that I think that autism itself should necessarily be eliminated. There are aspects of autism, such as rationality, ability to focus, which are good. Autists have often make very good scientists and mathematicians and computer programmers. And I think that from that perspective there are a lot of good qualities of autism. But nothing like that to me is worth not having empathy. Nothing. So ideally, I would like to see the empathy problems in autism cured, but the rest of autism, the positive aspects, in other words, left alone. However, if that is not possible, then, as I said, to me, there's no way that no matter whatever positive things I feel I might have gotten out of autism, and there are, having my heart opened, there's nothing better than that. Having a closed heart, I mean, that's not being open to God, or can be. There is, anecdotally, that I've observed subjectively, an extraordinarily high rate of atheism, agnosticism, religious skepticism among autists. If one cannot empathize, how can one empathize with a divine being? Many autists are drawn to things like Buddhism, which don't require that same level of empathy, and instead talk about compassion. And compassion can be a very rational activity. It can also be spiritual, but it can be rational. And mindfulness meditation appears to come very easily to many autists. So when I developed my meditative system, I called it intentionally heartfulness meditation, because I think that ultimately that is what most autists need. Not mindfulness, although mindfulness of course is important for everyone, but heartfulness, I think, is especially an important quality for autists to develop. That ability to connect with another soul, to connect with oneself, and to connect with God. Without that, ultimately nothing else, in my view, really matters. For this day, signing off. Speak with you next time.